They asked me once, a younger man at the dock, new hire, still sorting the difference between a transit manifest and a berth allocation, how a freight administrator from Kethai's platform had ended up in the Vethara conclave with 4 high counselors demanding his removal from the chamber. I told him the honest answer. I said, I married the wrong woman, and then I refused to stop being married to her. He laughed. He thought I was being self-deprecating. I was not. My name is Corlin Dissett. I am 43 years old. I have administered freight operations on Kethai's platform for 11 years, and before that I spent 9 years as a junior arbitration advocate in the Valdesi civil system, which sounds more impressive than it was. I sat in airless offices and read documents that other people had failed to read carefully, and I found the line in them that mattered, and I wrote it down, and occasionally it changed something. Mostly it did not. I left that work because the pay was worse than the freight dock, and the hours were the same, and I had begun to notice that I was very good at a thing nobody wanted done. That observation, in the end, turned out to be premature. I met Savith Kurath 3 years ago, in the intake corridor on level 4 of this same platform. I say this same platform because that is where the story ends, too, roughly 2 years and 4 months after it began. The Vethara conclave convened in the judicial chamber on level 9 of Kethai's platform, neutral ground, as all conclave sessions are required to be, on the 14th day of the 3rd transit cycle, and I was present for all of it. But I am getting ahead of myself. She was not dressed as an empress when I met her. I want to be clear about that, because later people would suggest I had known from the beginning, as though I had married her for reasons of ambition or strategy. She was dressed in the gray transit coverall that the platform issues to incoming refugees when their manifest declares a clothing shortfall, and she was standing at the secondary intake counter, arguing quietly with the classification officer about whether her status should be logged as displaced or stateless, because the difference, she said, mattered legally. The officer was not interested in what mattered legally. He had 43 other people in the queue behind her. I was walking past. I stopped. I do not know exactly why I stopped. I have thought about it since, and the most honest answer I can give is that her voice was very controlled and the officer's was not, and something in that ratio struck me as wrong. She was not raising her voice. She was not crying. She was reading him the relevant section of the Valdesi displacement protocol from a data chip she held between 2 fingers, and her hands were entirely steady, and she had the flat, focused patience of someone who has been ignored many times before and had decided not to let it work on her anymore. I asked the officer if there was a problem with the classification. He told me, not kindly, that it was none of my concern. I showed him my platform badge and told him that intake classification errors became my concern when they resulted in incorrect manifest filing, which they routinely did, and that I would appreciate a moment to review the record. He let me look because it was easier than arguing with a supervisor. She was right. The distinction between displaced and stateless carried different berthing rights, different access to the platform's legal aid terminal, and a different queue for the resettlement coordinator. She had been correctly citing the protocol. I told the officer to log it as displaced, and I countersigned the correction, and I moved on. She caught up to me at the end of the corridor. She said, "You did not have to do that." I said, "The filing would have been wrong." She looked at me for a moment with those pale amber eyes, horizontal pupils, the kind you see in some of the older Valdesi bloodlines, though I did not know then what bloodline she carried, and she said, "That is a very bureaucratic reason to help someone." I said, "I have a bureaucratic job." She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. That was how it began. I will not tell you that the next several months were simple, because they were not. She did not tell me who she was right away, and I did not ask in any way she was obligated to answer, and she gave me what she chose to give. Her name, her preference for bitter tea, Her habit of reading platform regulation documents the way other people read recreation files. Her opinion that the cargo routing on level 6 was optimized for speed at the cost of error reduction. That last one was correct, and I spent 3 weeks proving it and then rerouting accordingly, and she found that funny in a way she could not quite suppress. She had a quality I had not encountered often, which was that she noticed things precisely. Not aggressively. She was not the kind of person who performed her own intelligence, but she observed, and retained what she observed and connected it to other things she had retained. And when she spoke about what she had noticed, she spoke directly, without softening it into a question or hedging it into uncertainty. The cargo routing observation had been stated as a fact because it was a fact, verified by her own reading of the routing logs she had accessed on the platform's public terminal. She had, I learned later, done this with most of the platform's operational systems within 3 weeks of her arrival. She was not doing it to show me anything. She was doing it because she had nothing else to do, and idleness made her uncomfortable. And she had spent enough years governing a tier of the Valdesi system that studying how things worked was simply how she understood a new place. We ate in the platform cafeteria most evenings. She had a berth in the displaced residential block, and I had a small quarters unit on level 3, and we did not discuss what we were doing because it seemed, at the time, obvious enough not to require discussion. She was careful with me. Not distant, careful. The way you are careful with something you are not sure how long you get to keep. 2 months in, she told me about the voiding. She told me plainly, the way she did most things, sitting across from me in the cafeteria with a cup of bitter tea and her hands flat on the table. She told me she had been empress of the Valdesi second tier. She told me that a faction within her own court, 4 high counselors who had accumulated sufficient proxy votes among the lesser houses during a period when she had been managing a border dispute in the outer systems, had filed a decree of voiding against her in the Vethara conclave, alleging mental incapacitation, and that the conclave had accepted the filing and scheduled a ratification session. A voiding, if ratified, would strip her of all legal standing in Valdesi space. Not exile. Not demotion. Erasure in the legal sense, she would cease to exist as a person of record in any court the Valdesi Charter covered. She would have no property rights, no right of petition, no legal identity. The faction would assume the regency. She told me all of this in the same tone of voice she had used at the intake counter. I asked her why she had not told me sooner. She said she had not wanted it to change how I looked at her. I said, "How do I look at you?" She was quiet for a long moment. The cafeteria was half full around us, dock workers on a late shift change, a family from the displaced residential block with 2 children eating in the efficient, serious way children eat when they have learned not to leave food. And the light in there was the flat platform light that is the same at every hour because there are no windows on level 4. And in that light, I watched her decide whether to answer. She said, "Like I'm a person who's here." I said, "You are a person who's here." She looked at the table. Her jaw was set. She was not going to cry in the platform cafeteria, and I knew better than to expect it. But there was something in the set of her mouth that told me she had been carrying that sentence, "like I'm a person who's here," for a very long time, and had not expected to hear it said back to her so simply. I said, "Tell me about the voiding procedure." She told me. We were married 4 months later. I want to be honest about the sequence of events, which is that we were married in a Valdesi civil ceremony conducted by the platform's registry officer, and that I had read the relevant sections of Valdesi marriage law beforehand, and that under Valdesi law a spouse of record carries certain standing rights that a solo petitioner does not. I want to be honest about that because some people later would suggest that the marriage was purely a legal stratagem on her part, or purely a romantic gesture on mine. And the truth is that it was both, and that neither of those things diminishes the other. She asked me. I said yes, I meant it. I also, separately, thought it was the correct legal move, and she knew that I thought that, and she did not pretend otherwise, and we did not pretend to each other that it was not also true that I would have said yes regardless. The registry officer found the whole proceeding somewhat unusual. We did not explain it to him. The ratification session was scheduled for 14 months from that date. In those 14 months I read the Vethara Conclave Charter. I read the Valdesi Imperial Succession Codes. I read the archived proceedings of every voiding ratification session in the conclave's recorded history, which numbered 9, of which 6 had been ratified and 3 had been suspended on procedural grounds. I read the procedural grounds. I read the dissenting records from the suspended cases. I read arbitration precedents from the Valdesi civil system, the Outer Systems Tribunal, and 3 other judicial bodies, whose rulings the conclave had accepted as persuasive authority at various points in its history. I read all of this in the evenings, after the freight dock closed, on the reader I kept at my workstation, and occasionally during the slow periods in the middle of the day when the manifest queue was empty and the dock was quiet. It was not exciting reading. Long procedural documents rarely are, but I had spent 9 years learning to read them, which meant I had also spent 9 years learning to recognize the specific texture of a document that has been written to seem complete while omitting one thing, and the conclave charter had that texture in a particular section near the back, where the original founding articles gave way to the procedural codes that had been layered over them in subsequent generations. The procedural codes were thorough and well indexed. The founding articles were not well indexed, because they were 400 years old and had been written in a different era of legal drafting, and most people who used the conclave read the procedural codes and stopped there. Most people had not spent 9 years in the Valdesi Civil Arbitration Office, reading the documents other people stopped before finishing. I should say something about those 9 years, because people occasionally assume that the arbitration work had been a failure, that leaving it for the freight dock was a retreat from something better. It was not. The arbitration work had been the exact kind of work it appeared to be: careful, repetitive, occasionally useful, almost never acknowledged. I had sat in those offices and read thousands of documents, and found the relevant line in perhaps 100 of them, and made a difference in perhaps 30. By ordinary measures, that was a poor yield. By my own measure, it was the work itself, not the acknowledged outcomes, but the practice of reading precisely, the discipline of not concluding before finishing, the habit of checking the section that everyone else had decided was settled. I had left when the pay stopped being adequate, not when the work stopped being worth doing. The difference matters. Savith watched me read in the evenings and did not tell me to stop, which was the closest she came in those months to telling me she was grateful. She also watched me and said nothing when I reached the section of the charter I was looking for, which I found on a night in the 9th month, and which I read twice to make sure I had understood it correctly, and then read a 3rd time. When I set the reader down, she was already looking at me. She said, "What did you find?" I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That clause hasn't been invoked in 400 years. I said, "That doesn't mean it's not there." She said, "Corlin, the counselors will." I said, "I know what they'll do, let them." She looked at me with those pale amber eyes for a long time. The horizontal pupils made it difficult sometimes to read where her gaze was fixed, but I had learned over the months to watch the muscles at the corners of her eyes instead, and what I saw there in that moment was not hope exactly. It was something older and more careful than hope, something that had been disappointed enough times to be cautious about being disappointed again. But underneath it, faint and guarded, like a light in a room where someone has been careful to keep the door mostly shut, something that might, if not frightened away, become trust. I said, "Go to sleep. I have freight manifests in the morning." She almost laughed, not quite, but almost. I want to describe Kethai's platform for you, because it matters to understand what the Vethara conclave looked like inside it. Kethai's is a transit hub. It has always been a transit hub, built on a stable Lagrange point above the Val d'Isère ecliptic, where cargo routes from 4 different systems converge and separate again. It is not a glamorous place. The corridors are wide and practical, with color-coded floor guides and the slightly stale air that comes from recycling systems optimized for capacity rather than comfort, and the noise is the constant low percussion of docking clamps and cargo lifts, and people moving through. Level 9 is different. Level 9 was built specifically to host neutral proceedings. The conclave and its predecessors have been meeting there for 230 years, and the judicial chamber on Level 9 has high ceilings of dark composite paneling, and a floor of pale stone, and a raised bench for the presiding officers and tiered seating for observers. It is the most formal space on the platform, and it sits, which I have always found quietly appropriate, directly above the main cargo bay. We arrived the morning before the session. I had my reader. I had one document loaded on it, which I had printed as a backup on platform-certified paper and folded into the inside pocket of my jacket. The jacket I wore to formal freight arbitrations, which was gray and somewhat worn at the cuffs, and not the kind of jacket a man wears to a conclave session if he is trying to impress anyone. I was not trying to impress anyone. Savith had been given formal robes for the session. This was required by conclave procedure for the subject of avoiding, which is one of the procedures I find most calculated to humiliate, forcing the person whose existence is being adjudicated to dress in the ceremonial clothes of the office that is being taken from her, the way you might dress a person for their own funeral, and then make them attend it. The robes were deep red, the traditional Val d'Isère second-tier imperial color, and they fit her correctly, and she wore them with the kind of posture that does not ask anyone for an opinion about whether she looks appropriate. Her close-cropped dark hair and her amber eyes, and the set of her chin under those robes, produced an effect that I suspect the counselors had not thought through when they wrote the procedure, because she looked in those robes precisely like what she was. She had said to me the evening before, as we ate in the cafeteria for what might have been the last time or might not, that she had thought about what she wanted to say to me if the session did not go as we hoped. I told her I did not need her to say it. She said she knew I did not need her to say it, and that she was going to say it anyway, because she had spent enough of her life not saying things and she intended to stop doing that. She said, "Whatever the record shows tomorrow, I know what the record is." I said I knew what the record was too. She looked at me across the same table where she had told me about the voiding, the same flat platform light, and she said, "You have been the most unexpected thing in my life." I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "That is a very calm response." I said, "I have a calm job." This time she did smile, the real one, the unguarded one, and it was there for a moment and then it was gone, tucked away for safekeeping, and she drank her tea and so did I. The conclave convened at the 3rd platform hour. The presiding officer was a Vethara neutral, a conclave appointee, not affiliated with any Val d'Isère faction. A woman named Arbitress Dalhin Vass, who had the permanently slightly tired expression of someone who has spent 20 years resolving disputes between parties who are not arguing in good faith. She convened the session with the standard formal language and read the filing into the record. Decree of voiding, filed by the combined authority of the 4 high counselors of the Val d'Isère second tier, against Savith Curath, formerly styled empress of the Val d'Isère second tier, on the grounds of adjudicated mental incapacitation. The 4 counselors sat at the petitioner's table to the left of the chamber. I want to give them their due description, because they were not stupid men. They were the kind of men who are not stupid, who have spent their lives being not stupid in the specific way that involves reading every room correctly and always positioning themselves on the side of the outcome that appears most certain. The first counselor, Havith Soon, was older than the other 3, with the broad flat face common to the northern Val d'Isère lineages and very steady gray eyes, and the manner of a man who has won so many proceedings that he has stopped thinking about the possibility that he might not win one. He wore the formal black of the consularate. He sat very straight. He had looked at Savith when she entered the chamber, not the other way around, which might have read as indifference, but at her, directly, with a look that was measuring something. And then he had looked away. That told me he was not indifferent. That told me he was a man who looked at things carefully and then deliberately chose not to look at them, which is a different thing entirely. Savith sat at the respondent's table to the right. She was permitted, under conclave procedure, to have one counsel of record seated beside her. Under normal circumstances, that counsel would have been a Valdesi court advocate. Under our circumstances, it was me. The counselor's advocate, a professional conclave litigant named Furth Allah, who wore robes that cost more than my freight administrator's annual salary, and had the polished, confident manner of someone who had never lost a voiding, looked at me when I took my seat beside Savith and then looked away again, which is a specific kind of dismissal. Not even worth forming a reaction to. Just, assessed, found irrelevant, filed. He was not entirely wrong about me, but he had filed me in the wrong category. The opening statements were what I had expected. Furth Allah presented the voiding petition in the practiced fluid language of his profession, the documented episodes of what he termed behavioral departure from the norms of imperial governance, the testimony of counselors and court functionaries, the medical assessments conducted by consularate-approved physicians, the records of decisions made during the border dispute that he characterized as erratic and impulsive. He laid it out methodically, each element connected to the next, the whole thing building toward a conclusion that felt, the way he told it, not like an argument but like a description of something already known. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He presented his case the way a man presents something he has already won and is simply reading into the official record. I noticed First Counselor soon watching me while Furth Allah spoke, not Savith, me. He had already formed his assessment of Savith. She was the subject of the proceeding, not a variable. He was curious about me in the way a man is curious about something small and out of place in a room he believes he controls entirely. When Furth Allah finished, Arbitress Vass asked me to present the respondent's position. I said that the respondent held that the medical assessments were conducted by physicians whose appointments were controlled by the consularate, and therefore lacked independence, that the behavioral evidence cited consisted of decisions made under crisis conditions in the outer system's border dispute that were consistent with legitimate emergency governance, and that the voiding petition had been filed in bad faith by a faction seeking to claim a regency they had been unable to obtain through legitimate succession. Furth Allah raised an objection on the grounds that characterizing the petition as bad faith was an unsupported assertion. Arbitress Vass noted the objection and told me to confine myself to the record. I said I would do my best. First Counselor soon, I noticed, smiled slightly. It was the smile of a man observing a procedure playing out exactly as anticipated. The session continued. Furth Allah called 2 witnesses, a former court functionary and one of the consularate physicians. I cross-examined both of them on the specifics of their testimony. The court functionary had been in Savith's service during the border dispute, and he had testified about 3 decisions she had made during that period that Furth Allah had characterized as deviating from standard protocol. I asked him, for each of the 3, whether standard protocol in the outer systems had ever been formally adapted for border emergency conditions. He said it had. I asked him whether Savith's decisions had been within the range of adaptations that had been used by previous second-tier governors during comparable emergencies. He said he was not certain. I asked him whether he had, at any point, been provided a comparative analysis of previous border emergency governance decisions to use as a reference when forming his testimony. He said he had not. I noted for the record that the testimony was based on an impression of deviation from standard protocol without a comparative baseline. For the physician, I pointed out that his assessment had been conducted over 2 sessions totaling approximately 4 hours, which he confirmed, and that the standard for the kind of incapacitation cited in the voiding required a longitudinal assessment of no fewer than 12 sessions under the Valdesi medical protocol, which he confirmed was correct. When I asked him why his assessment had not met that standard, he said that the circumstances had not permitted a longer assessment. I asked him what circumstances. He said the respondent had been unavailable. I asked him whether the respondent had been formally notified of the assessment requirement and given a scheduled opportunity to comply. He paused. He said he believed so. I said I would note for the record that the documentation package did not include a formal notification or a scheduling record, and that if the arbitress wished to verify the notification's existence, she was welcome to request it from the petitioners. Arbitress Vass noted all of it. She had been writing steadily since the cross-examinations began, which was a good sign. Arbitresses who have already decided do not take extensive notes. It was not enough. I knew it was not enough. The counselors had the votes. They had spent the better part of 2 years assembling proxy commitments from the lesser houses, and procedural irregularities in the evidentiary package would produce, at best, footnotes in the ruling, not a reversal. Furth Allen knew it too, and he had already begun the small adjustments of posture and expression that lawyers make when they are moving from argument to conclusion. Then Haveth soon leaned forward slightly and spoke, not to the arbitress, but across the chamber to me, and he said, "Arbitress, with respect, I would note for the record that the counsel appearing for the respondent holds a freight administrator's position on this platform. He has no formal standing as a legal advocate and no certification from any court of record. His presence here as counsel is a courtesy of procedure, not an entitlement of competence." He said it pleasantly, in the tone of a man who is not making an attack but merely clarifying a fact, in the tone of a man who wants the chamber to hear clearly that the thing on the other side of the table is not worthy of serious engagement. Furth Allen nodded slightly, as though agreeing with something reasonable. Savith, beside me, did not move. Her hands were flat on the table. I had learned to watch her hands and not her face in moments like this, and her hands were completely still, which meant she was deciding internally whether she was going to let this land on her. I did not look at her face because I did not want to see what was on it, not because I thought it would be weakness. She was not weak, but because I knew what the sentence had cost her, and I did not want to register it while I was still thinking. Arbitress Vass began to say something to the effect that the counsel's credentials were a matter for her review, and not for opposing parties to. I said, if First Counselor Soon would like to address my standing, I would invite him to do so completely. The room went slightly quieter. Not silent. There were observers in the tiered gallery above us, about 30 individuals, and they didn't stop breathing, but the particular kind of quieter that happens when a room recalibrates what kind of proceeding it's in. First Counselor Soon's pleasant expression did not change. He said, "The counsel is welcome to establish his standing if he believes he has any." I opened my reader. I said, I was, prior to my current position, a junior arbitration advocate in the Valdesi civil system for 9 years. I hold a certification of record from the Valdesi Civil Arbitration Board, which has not lapsed, which is listed in the public registry, and which the first counselor was welcome to review at any point in the 14 months since this session was scheduled. Furth Allen made a note. Soon said, still pleasantly, "Civil arbitration certification is not equivalent to conclave advocacy certification. You have no standing in this chamber." I said, I didn't say I was claiming conclave advocacy standing. He said, then what standing are you claiming? I said, pursuant to Section 14, Article 3 of the Vethara Conclave Founding Charter, a party to a conclave proceeding who holds an active civil arbitration certification from any recognized judicial body within the Charter's jurisdiction may, at their own petition, invoke the right of direct address on behalf of a respondent in a voiding proceeding. This right predates the conclave's current advocacy certification system by approximately 80 years and was not superseded by it, because the Charter's Article 17 specifies that no subsequent procedural rule may nullify a standing right enumerated in the original articles without a full conclave vote. No such vote has been held. The right is dormant but unextinguished. The room was quiet. Not the calculated quiet of Soon's delivery. A different kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people has simultaneously realized that something they were sure of is less sure than they thought. Furth Allah had stopped writing. He was looking at his reader with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself in the airless offices. The expression of a man who is rapidly checking a thing he had assumed he did not need to check. Arbitress Vass said, very precisely, "Counsel d'essai, are you prepared to cite the specific article?" I said, Section 14, Article 3, Subsection 2, Paragraph 4, ratified in the original Charter, Year 1 of the Conclave's foundation, signed by all 7 founding arbiters. I have the original Charter text on my reader and a printed copy if the arbitress would like to review it. She said I would. I walked to the bench and gave her the printed copy. The paper was certified platform issue. I had printed and certified it through the platform's legal documentation system 3 weeks before the session. She unfolded it. She read the relevant section. She read it again. First Counselor Soon said, and the pleasantness in his voice had shifted into something with a harder edge beneath it. This is a procedural curiosity. Whatever the original Charter may have said, it has no practical bearing on. Arbitress Vass held up one hand without looking away from the document. Soon stopped. She read it a third time. Then she set the document on the bench and looked at Furth Allah and said, "Advocate Allah, I will need your response to the cited article within this session. If you require a recess to review, I will grant it." Furth Allah said, "I would appreciate a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes. I sat at the respondent's table and drank water from the carafe that a platform attendant had brought out. Savith sat beside me. For the first part of the recess she did not speak. Then she said, very quietly so that only I could hear, "You found that 8 months ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "I didn't want you to start hopping too early." She looked at the table. There was a long pause. Then she said, "That is a very bureaucratic reason to protect someone." I said, "I have a bureaucratic job." This time she did laugh. Quietly, barely audible but real. I felt it more than heard it. A slight release of something she had been holding for the entire morning. Then she stopped and composed herself and looked forward again, and I looked forward too, and we waited. I will tell you what I saw in the petitioner's table during the recess, because it was useful information. Furth Allah had his reader and was working rapidly, 2 fingers moving across the surface in the way advocates move when they are looking for a counterargument against time. The second and third counselors were consulting in low voices. The fourth, the youngest of them, a man named Dareth Sav, who I had noted at the start of the session, because he had been the one who had filed the initial proxy commitments, was very still in his chair and looking at nothing in particular, which was the posture of a man who had just begun to do arithmetic and did not like the numbers. First Counselor Soon was not doing any of these things. He was sitting exactly as he had been sitting before the recess, hands on the table, watching the front of the chamber, and his expression was the expression of a man who is deciding not whether he has a problem but how large the problem is, and what shape it takes from here. The recess ended. Furth Allah returned with the expression of a man who had done rapid research and found what he did not want to find. He confirmed, for the record, that the cited article was present in the original Charter text and had not been formally superseded. He presented two arguments for why it should be construed narrowly. One regarding the definition of recognized judicial body, and one regarding whether the right applied to voiding proceedings specifically versus other conclave proceedings. I responded to both. The definition of recognized judicial body in Article 14's own language included any civil arbitration board chartered under Valdesi law, which the Civil Arbitration Board was, which was checkable in the registry and which I had already cited. On the question of whether the right applied to voiding proceedings, Article 14's heading was Rights of Parties in Extraordinary Proceedings, and the conclave's own procedural code classified voiding proceedings as extraordinary in its first definitional section, which I cited by section number. Arbitress Vass reviewed both citations. She made 2 entries in the session record. Then she said, I find that the right enumerated in Section 14, Article 3, Subsection 2, Paragraph 4 of the Vethara Conclave Founding Charter is active and properly invoked. Counsel Desai's standing in this proceeding is established. The objection to his standing is dismissed. First Counselor Soon was very still. I had watched a lot of people be very still in rooms where something had not gone the way they planned, and the ones who were most dangerous in that moment were always the ones who went still, not the ones who reacted. Soon was that kind. He was recalculating. I watched him recalculate. He looked at Furth Allah, and Furth Allah looked back at him, and something passed between them in that look that I could not read precisely but recognized in shape. The look of 2 people revising their understanding of what the next several hours were going to require. I pressed the advantage. With my standing established, I moved to the substantive argument I had been saving. I said that the voiding petition's evidentiary basis was insufficient under 3 separate standards, and I proceeded through them in order. The first was the medical assessment standard I had already raised, the longitudinal requirement, and I now cited the specific Valdesi medical protocol section, the paragraph number, and the founding case in which it had been established. The second was an evidentiary standard specific to voiding proceedings. That behavioral evidence of incapacitation had to be drawn from decisions made in standard governance conditions, not emergency conditions, because the conclave's own precedent from a session 90 years prior, I cited the session record by date and case number, had ruled that crisis period decisions could not be used as incapacitation evidence without a separate expert analysis of what constituted standard response under those specific crisis conditions. And no such analysis had been provided. The third was procedural. The proxy vote assembly that gave the councilors their majority had involved 3 lesser House representatives who had been placed under economic pressure by councilor rate-affiliated trade agreements, and I had documentation of the timing of those agreements relative to the proxy commitments. That last one was not from my charter research. That came from Savith, who had spent 14 months in quiet contact with people in the outer houses who had their own grievances with the councilor rate, and who had chosen, carefully, to share certain records with her. She had not told me she was doing this, not because she was concealing it from me, but because she had understood without my saying so that separate knowledge was safer than combined knowledge. If I did not know the extent of the documentation before the session, I could not be asked about it in any pre-session communication that might be reviewed. She had gathered it and said nothing about it to anyone because she understood the same thing I understood. You do not show a card until the moment its effect cannot be undone. She had handed me the documentation the evening before the session, without commentary, folded inside the platform's legal certification sleeve. I had read it that night and added it to the printed backup in my jacket pocket. The documentation was platform certified. I submitted it to the record. The session went for another 3 hours after that. Furth Allah was very good at his work. I want to give him that, and he pushed back on each point with intelligence and preparation, and on 2 of them he forced me to a narrower position than I wanted, and on one of them, regarding the precise scope of the proxy vote documentation, Arbitress Vass ruled partially in his favor and partially in mine. It was not a clean sweep. I had not expected a clean sweep. What I had expected was to give Arbitress Vass enough material that the ratification became something she could not, with clear conscience and a clear session record, simply approve. At the fourth platform hour past noon, Arbitress Vass called for closing statements. Furth Allah's closing statement was professional and thorough. He summarized the petition's evidentiary basis, acknowledged the procedural questions I had raised, and characterized them as matters of interpretation that did not, in his view, rise to the level of defeating the core petition. He said the councilors sought only to ensure stable governance of the second tier and had pursued the voiding through proper channels in good faith. I said, the respondent holds that the voiding petition was constructed using compromised medical evidence, evidence gathered under conditions that the conclave's own precedent excludes, and proxy votes assembled through economic coercion. These are not matters of interpretation. They are matters of record, and they are now in the record of this session. The arbitress must determine whether the conclave was meant to serve as a mechanism for legitimate adjudication or as a ratification apparatus for outcomes that have already been arranged. The Charter has an answer to that question. Section 1, the Purpose Clause, describes this body as the guarantor of justice between parties who cannot obtain it elsewhere. The respondent has no other court. She is here because this is the last place that is supposed to be neutral. The arbitress knows what the record shows. I sat down. Arbitress Vass was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she would issue a preliminary ruling within 1 platform day and a full ruling within 3, and she suspended the session. The gallery had been very quiet for the last 2 hours. As people began to move, I heard the specific texture of the noise, not the relief noise of an outcome concluded, but the unsettled noise of people who had expected to watch a ratification and had instead watched something else happen in the room. We left the chamber and went to the corridor outside. Savith stood beside me with her hands at her sides, and her robes very straight, and her face composed in the particular way it was composed when she was not permitting herself to feel something until she had privacy to feel it correctly. The observers from the gallery were moving past us, and some of them were looking at her, and I watched their faces because I had learned, in my years in the civil arbitration system, to read what a room thought before it said it. What I saw in the faces of the observers was not what had been in those faces at the start of the session. At the start of the session, when we had walked in, the faces had been the faces of people who had come to observe a procedure they expected to be concluded quickly. Routine, already decided, the respondent as a figure in a formality. Now they looked at her the way you look at something you have been told is one thing and have just discovered is another. The way you look when the room's understanding has been corrected and your eyes are still in the process of catching up. An outer house representative, a woman from one of the border systems, I recognized her insignia, paused as she passed and inclined her head to Savith, a small formal gesture, the kind of inclination that in Valdesi court custom carries meaning. I see you, and I record that I see you. Savith returned it with a slight incline of her own. The woman moved on. A second observer paused and did the same, then a third. I did not count how many. I was watching Savith. Her jaw was set, her eyes were forward, her hands had not moved from her sides. But at the corner of her eyes, there, in the muscles I had learned to watch, was the thing she was not permitting herself to feel yet in the corridor, visible only because I was close enough to see it. A brightness, contained, the light in a room where someone has carefully begun to open the door. I said, "Let's get tea." She said, "Yes." We went to the platform cafeteria on level 4, where we had eaten most evenings for the past 2 years, and we got bitter tea and sat across from each other at the same table where she had first told me about the voiding, and neither of us said very much. There was not a great deal to say. The preliminary ruling would come when it came, and the full ruling would come after that, and I had done what I could do with what I had found, and now we were in the part that was not mine to control. After a while she said, "You read every voiding case in the archive?" I said, "Yes." She said, 9 cases, 6 ratified." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you found the clause anyway?" I said, "It was there to be found." She looked at me across the table with those pale amber eyes and the horizontal pupils that I had learned to read not by the pupils themselves, but by everything around them, and she said, "Why?" Not why did you find it, not why did you invoke it, just why, the question beneath all the other questions. I said, "Because you were right, and the record was wrong, and someone who can read a document should read the document." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is a very bureaucratic answer." I said, "I know." She said, "Corlin." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." She said it in the plain way she said things, without decoration, looking straight at me, and I understood that she was not only thanking me for the clause and the session and the 14 months of reading. She was thanking me for the intake corridor and the classification form and the bitter tea and the cargo routing on level 6, and the way I had looked at her, consistently, as a person who was there, as someone whose being there was not a problem to be solved or a condition to be managed but a simple fact, the same kind of fact as the manifest errors and the routing inefficiencies, the kind of fact that was just true and that I was not going to pretend was not. I said, "You're welcome." The preliminary ruling came the next morning. Arbitrus Vass issued it in the standard session record format, which I read on my reader at the freight dock before my shift began. It suspended the ratification pending a full evidentiary review of the medical assessment methodology and the proxy vote documentation. It required the counselors to produce independent medical assessors, not counselor rate appointed, and to respond to the proxy vote documentation within 30 days. It did not rule on the merits yet, because preliminary rulings do not, but it used the word irregular 4 times in describing the counselor's evidentiary package, which in conclave legal language is a specific word with specific weight. I noted the 4 instances of irregular and sent the preliminary ruling to Savith's data chip, and I went back to the freight manifest. The full ruling came 16 days later. I will tell you what it said, because it is the part the observers in the gallery had come expecting not to see, and it is the part that matters. Arbitrus Vass found that the medical assessments failed the longitudinal standard and could not be used as the evidentiary basis for incapacitation. She found that the behavioral evidence drawn from crisis period decisions was excluded under the 90-year precedent, which I had cited correctly, and which she confirmed applied to voiding proceedings. She found that the proxy vote documentation indicated a pattern of economic pressure that warranted an investigation by the conclave's independent review body. She suspended the voiding decree indefinitely pending the completion of that investigation. She further noted, and this was the line I read 3 times, that Section 14, Article 3 had been properly invoked, and that the Respondents' Counsel had presented a case of unusual procedural thoroughness that this proceeding was the better for. The voiding was suspended. Not dismissed, suspended, pending investigation, which meant it was not over in the final legal sense, and I did not pretend to Savith that it was over, because she deserved accuracy more than comfort. But suspended meant that the decree could not take effect. Suspended meant that her legal standing was intact. Suspended meant that the counselors had gone into the Vethara conclave with a ratification they had spent 2 years arranging, and had come out with an investigation and a procedural rebuke in the official record of a neutral judicial body. The investigation took 14 months. I will not give you all of those months in detail, because most of them were the work of other people. The conclave's independent review body, the outer house representatives who had been in the gallery that day and had chosen afterward to provide their own documentation, and Savith herself, who was methodical about producing records when she knew someone was actually going to read them. I administered the freight dock. I read in the evenings, though I was reading different things now, not preparatory documents but the ordinary reading of a man who has completed a task and is deciding what to do next with the part of his brain that had been occupied by it. The dock ran well. The routing on level 6 stayed corrected. I filed accurate manifests. Savith and I lived in the quarters on level 3, which were still my quarters but had become, over time, our quarters in the practical sense without anyone formally deciding that they had. And she continued to observe the platform's operational systems and occasionally to suggest improvements that were invariably correct. And I implemented them. And the platform ran better for it, and none of the people who benefited knew why. She did not talk much about the investigation. When she had something specific to tell me, she told me. When she did not fill the space with approximations, which was one of the things about her I had come to understand as a form of respect, that she treated the absence of information as something to acknowledge rather than paper over with comfortable guesses. At the end of the 14 months, the conclave's independent review body issued its findings, which confirmed the pattern of economic coercion documented in the proxy vote materials, and referred the matter to the Valdesi Second Tier's own governance tribunal for action against the 4 councillors. The voiding petition was formally dismissed. Savith returned to the Second Tier 3 weeks after the dismissal. She asked me to come with her. I said I would need to file a notice with the freight dock, which made her laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she didn't deploy often, and then I said yes. The return was formal. There are ceremonies for the restoration of an imperial standing that had been under voiding proceedings, and they are long and particular, and I stood through all of them beside Savith in the great hall of the second-tier court, in my gray jacket with the worn cuffs, because she had not asked me to wear anything else and I had not offered to, and because the jacket was, after all, the jacket I wore to formal arbitrations, and that was what this was. The court was full. Not the 4 councillors, they were facing the governance tribunal's proceedings and had declined, wisely, to be present, but the lesser houses and the outer system representatives and the court functionaries and the staff and the people who fill a court, because a court is a place where things are decided and people want to see what is decided. They stood in the old ranks of Valdesi ceremony, and they watched. Savith stood at the center of the hall in the formal robes, the same deep red she had worn in the conclave chamber, but these were the restoration robes, which are cut differently, which acknowledge by their cut that the return is from somewhere difficult. She stood with the posture that did not ask anyone for an opinion, and she spoke the restoration oath in her own voice, which was controlled and clear and entirely without performance. When the oath was completed, the senior court registrar formally acknowledged her standing, which is the procedural moment in a restoration at which the court is supposed to demonstrate recognition, and the court was quiet for the half-second before the recognition begins. And in that half-second, I was aware of the specific quality of the quiet, the same quality I had felt in the conclave chamber when I had cited the clause, the quality of a room recalibrating what it understands. And then the recognition came, the formal inclination of the court, the acknowledgement of the senior house representatives, and it moved through the hall in the way that formal recognition moves, house by house, rank by rank, each one a record entered, a statement made in the language of standing and witness. I see you, and I record that I see you. I watched Savith receive it. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was level. Her eyes were forward, and then, after a moment, they moved to me, not a look that was asking for anything, not a look that was seeking permission or reassurance or verification. Just a look that was what it was, the look of someone who is in a room where they belong and knows it, and wanted, in the moment of knowing it, to find the face of the person who helped them get there. I met her eyes. I gave her the small nod that means, yes, I see it. Yes, this is real. The recognition continued around the hall. We left the court in the late afternoon, through the side entrance to the courtyard where the transport that had brought us was waiting, and the courtyard had the pale stone and the long shadows of late afternoon, and the smell of the air recyclers mixed with whatever grew in the courtyard planting beds, which I did not know the name of but which smelled like something old and green. Savith walked beside me and did not speak for a while, and I did not speak either. Then she said, "You'll find the freight routing here is worse than Kethai's." I said, "I will fix it." She said, "I know you will." We kept walking. The shadows were long and the air was cool and the transport was at the end of the courtyard, and there were people moving in the corridors beyond the arched gate, the ordinary movement of a court resuming its ordinary function after a long interruption. I had a reader in my jacket pocket, and a certification that had been dormant for 9 years, and a section of a charter that had been dormant for 400, and neither of them was dormant any longer. And that was the accurate and bureaucratic way to describe what had happened over the past 3 years. But the more accurate way, the one I returned to in the evenings after, and there were many evenings after, at the desk I set up in the new quarters on the second tier, reading the freight routing documentation and the governance protocols and the accumulated files of a court that had been running without correction for 2 years, was this. I had found a line in a document, the way I had always found the line in documents, and I had used it, the way you use the line that is there to be used, and the woman beside me was walking in a courtyard that was hers again, and she was already pointing out the routing inefficiencies to me, which was how I knew she was, in fact, all right. The young man at the dock asked me later how it had ended. I told him, "She's home and the filing is correct." He did not entirely know what to do with that answer. I understood. It sounds small, the way the true things often do when you say them plainly. But small is not the same as wrong, and plain is not the same as simple, and the line is there or it is not, and if it is there, someone who can read a document should read it. That is all.